Welcome back. You're watching NewsX. My name is Vineet Malhotra. In an unprecedented move on Wednesday, the 7th of January, President Trump signed an executive order suspending U.S. participation in 66 UN agencies and international organizations, including the UN Climate Treaty, marking a major retreat from global cooperation. In the presidential memorandum issued on Wednesday, President Trump directed the withdrawal from 66 organizations, agencies and commissions, deeming them contrary to the interests of the United States. The directive, issued on the 7th of Jan, follows Executive Order 14199, which requires a comprehensive review of all international bodies to identify those considered wasteful, ineffective or harmful to American interests. The list encompasses 31 United Nations entities and 35 non-UN organizations, spanning high-profile scientific panels to lesser-known agricultural committees. Hello and welcome to NewsX Deep Dive. Today we look at the United States' decision to pull out of 66 United Nations and international bodies, a move that includes key platforms focused on climate action, peace building and democratic governance. In a press statement by the U.S. Secretary of State, these international organizations are labeled wasteful, ineffective or harmful. Let's take a look today. In further of Executive Order 14199, President Trump announced that the withdrawal of the United States from 66 international organizations identified as part of the Trump administration's review of wasteful, ineffective and harmful international organizations. Review of additional international organizations pursuant to Executive Order remains ongoing. The Trump administration has found these institutions to be redundant in their scope, mismanaged, unnecessary, wasteful, poorly run, captured by the interest of actors advancing their own agendas contrary to our own, or a threat to our nation's sovereignty, freedoms and general prosperity. President Trump is clear. It is no longer acceptable to be sending these institutions the blood, sweat and treasure of the American people with little to nothing to show for it. The days of billions of dollars in taxpayer money flowing to foreign interests at the expense of our people are over, as this list begins to demonstrate what started as a pragmatic framework of international organizations for peace and cooperation has morphed into a sprawling architecture of global governance, often dominated by progressive ideology and detached from national interests. From DEI mandates to gender equity campaigns to climate orthodoxy, many international organizations now serve a globalist project rooted in the discredited fantasy of the end of history. These organizations actively seek to constrain American sovereignty. Their work is advanced by the same elite networks, the multilateral NGOplex, that we have begun dismantling through the closure of through U.S. aid, I beg your pardon. We will not continue expending resources, diplomatic capital and the legitimization weight of our participation in institutions that are irrelevant to or in conflict with our interests. We reject inertia and ideology in favor of prudence and purpose. We seek cooperation where it serves our people and will stand firm where it does not. Let's take a look at 10 organizations from the 66 international bodies the U.S. announced withdrawal from in January 2026, starting with the Indian-led body, the International Solar Alliance. This intergovernmental organization was launched by India and France on the 30th of November 2015 with the aim of promoting solar energy deployment to enhance energy access, security and transition in solar-rich countries. Remarkably, it now has over 120 signatory countries with more than 100 full members. The U.S. became the 101st member on the 10th of November 2021, years after co-founders India and France initiated it, and the framework entered force in 2017 following initial ratifications by nations like India, France, Australia and several African countries. Upon joining, the U.S. pledged $25 million over 5 years to support ISA initiatives, contributing approximately $5 million annually towards international and operational costs and solar projects in developing nations. The U.S. exit from the ISA on the 7th of Jan as part of withdrawing from international bodies deemed contrary to American interests could slow investment mobilization and project momentum. Another consequential withdrawal from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, a UN treaty body overseeing international climate agreements. It stands for global cooperation to combat climate change and its impacts, with significance in facilitating annual COP meetings and frameworks like the Paris Agreement, which influence worldwide emissions policies. Established in 1992, the U.S. has previously withdrawn and rejoined under different administrations. The UNFCCC was just one of as many as 66 international agreements and organizations that the United States withdrew from on Thursday, stating they no longer serve American interests. As the foundational international agreement on climate change, UNFCCC acknowledged the problem and laid down basic principles for tackling the issue. The 2015 Paris Agreement and the 1997 Kyoto Protocol before it are instruments of the UNFCCC, guiding global action on climate in a relationship similar to a constitution and the laws made under it. Next, the UN Population Fund is a UN agency focused on reproductive health and population issues. It stands for advancing sexual and reproductive health rights, gender equality, and sustainable population growth, supporting maternal and child health programs in 150 plus countries to reduce mortality and aid family planning. It is often embroiled in U.S. funding debates over abortion-related policies. Next, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change serves as a scientific body under an auspices assessing climate science. It stands for providing objective data on climate risks and responses, with its reports guiding global policy and influencing treaties and national strategies on warming limits. A Nobel Peace Prize winner in 2007, it involves thousands of scientists voluntarily. The UN Conference on Trade Development is a UN body addressing trade, investment and development. It stands for promoting equitable global trade for developing nations, advising on economic policy, the digital economy and sustainable development goals. Established in 1964, it serves as a key forum for North-South economic dialogues. The UN entity for gender equality and empowerment of women is a UN agency dedicated to gender issues. It stands for advancing women's rights, leadership and economic empowerment, coordinating UN efforts on gender and supporting anti-violence laws and equality in 100 plus countries. Formed in 2010 by merging prior entities, it focused on ending discrimination. The International Renewable Energy Agency is an intergovernmental organization promoting renewables. It stands for accelerating the transition to sustainable energy sources, providing data and policy to approximately 160 plus members. The U.S. was a founding member but withdrew previously. The International Union for Conservation of Nature is another global network of government where the U.S. has withdrawn from. It stands for protecting biodiversity and sustainable resource use, and of course also includes endangered species and influences environmental laws worldwide. It was founded in 1948. Finally, the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum is an informal multilateral platform focused on counter-terrorism reforms and efforts. It stands for reducing global vulnerability to terrorism by preventing, combating and prosecuting terrorist acts while countering incitement and recruitment. It facilitates meetings for national officials, capacity building and strategy development among 29 countries and the EU, contributing to international architecture for addressing terrorism. Remarkably, co-founded by the US and Turkey in 2011, it hosts annual ministerial meetings as well. And the UN Cultural Agency, UNESCO, is also another one. The withdrawal stems from President Trump's America's First policy, aiming to disengage from entities deemed wasteful or are ineffective. It also talks about sovereignty, multilateral engagement. The administration frames its withdrawal as a way to protect American independence and stopping subsidization of international bureaucracies, and it ensures that U.S. only engages in international cooperation when it clearly benefits in this entire situation. So obviously the priorities under Donald Trump have effectively changed. We're going to talk about this with our guest. Joining us on the platform at this point in time is Ambassador Prabhu Dayal, former diplomat. Ambassador Dayal, sir, always a pleasure to have you. Well, this is extremely obfuscating to me, sir. The Americans are today, because of their contribution to these multilateral forums, which have facilitated global causes and America's causes in more ways than one. If America is going to withdraw from most of these ventures and forums, they might as well hand over their permanent membership in the United Nations to another country as well. Perhaps India could bid that exchange.
Well, Vineet, thanks for having me on your show. Based on his America First policy, Donald Trump has consistently demonstrated a strong preference for unilateralism. Trump has repeatedly questioned the effectiveness, cost, and usefulness of the international bodies, arguing that they often fail to serve US interests. And instead of working within large multilateral frameworks, Trump has favored one-on-one transactional arrangements where he believes the US can exert maximum leverage. The Trump administration has engaged in a comprehensive review of all US treaties and international organizations to assess whether they align with US national interests, particularly in order to assess whether the US needs to indulge in further withdrawals or further reductions in funding. Now, this pattern indicates a fundamental shift away from the multilateralism towards a more unilateral and transactional foreign policy approach. And as you pointed out during your introductory remarks, this stance also represents a significant departure from decades of foreign policy, which historically helped and led many of the multilateral institutions created after World War II. So while America was a leading player in the multilateral organizations, it has now demonstrated that it doesn't want to be involved beyond a very limited extent with multilateral institutions. And as you pointed out, even the United Nations has been spoken about with great contempt by Donald Trump. If you remember when he addressed the United Nations some months ago, and then he complained that all that the UN had given him was a faulty teleprompter and a faulty escalator. In other words, finding fault with everything within the UN system. And as you suggested, if he's so contemptuous towards it, why not yield the permanent membership to another country, particularly a country which deserves it, like India? Now, as you mentioned, the Trump administration had already withdrawn from or ceased funding to a significant number of international organizations and agreements, which include the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Agreement, the UN Human Rights Council, UNESCO, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, and the Iran nuclear deal. Now, yesterday, the Trump administration signed executive orders to withdraw from 66 other multilateral organizations, agencies, and commissions. These include the UN Population Fund, the International Solar Alliance, and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, what happens next is the question.
Ambassador Dayal, I also wanted to pick your brain on another thing, and if you can, sir, be succinct with your answer as well. There are a lot of international standards which are being challenged by Donald Trump at this point in time. Look at what's happened in Venezuela. Look at what's happening or will happen in Colombia. Look at what's going on in Europe at the same time as well. What is this behavior likely to do, to the global power balance that has kept wars and tensions at bay for decades after World War II?
Well, certainly it will throw everything into a spin. Donald Trump doesn't need the UN, he thinks, and he feels that might is right, and he can do as he pleases as long as he has the power to do it. That's why he did what he did in Venezuela and is now threatening to take over Greenland. This naturally throws the entire multilateral system into a spin, into disarray. But then, because of the contempt that Trump has towards multilateralism, I'm not surprised that he wants to do away with all these multilateral institutions, which fetter him and which restrict him to some extent, and he wants to do as he pleases.
All right, Ambassador Dayal, always a pleasure having you, sir. Thank you so much for being here. On that note, we're going to dip into a very short break. We'll be right back.